and a very warm welcome to the analyst discussion of
Today is 8th of September.
we will be covering some very important current affair articles featured in the Indian Express and website of the Hindu as the paper was unavailable for today. The important topics that we shall be covering first of all is the culture of adjournment or also known as judicial pendency that is rising in India as also highlighted by President Murmu recently. In the second one, we will look into the reasons, causes, and impact of extreme climate events and their threats, especially when it has been highlighted by a report that 85% of the Indian districts are affected by the same. Next, we will look into the Premier Financial Investigation Agency of India Enforcement Directorate. Then we will analyze what is the viability of conducting or having National Register for Citizen NRC, especially for the state of Assam. Then we will look into a geophysical phenomena now turned into a disaster, a typhoon Yagi. And we will wind up the discussion with prelim snippets, very interesting and informative. So stay tuned for a very insightful discussion coming up ahead. So now, please pay your attention to the first topic in hand, which is very crucial for the examination, especially mains point of view. This is about the case of judicial pendency or the Tariq pe Tariq syndrome of our courts. So what is the context that recently what happened? A national conference on district judiciary was held, and this was addressed by President Draupadi Murmu, who highlighted the fact that over 30 years old cases about of the quantum of 62,000 have been held pending in our high courts. She also highlighted the case of the culture of adjournments in the judiciary, and this also becomes very important for analyzing a very important lacuna of Indian judiciary. So hereupon, we will start discussion of judicial pendency, which also stands for the number or the syndrome of rising amount of unresolved cases in the Indian judiciary. So when there are unresolved cases not resolved in due time, it also leads to delay in justice. And you know how the entire statement takes place. Justice delayed is justice denied. To deal away with these syndromes, we need to understand quite a few things. First of all, what is the existing status of judicial pendency? Second is, what are the reasons that are leading to this rising pendency? Third, if there is judicial pendency, then what is its impact on the socio-economic and political fabric of our country? Then, what are the steps taken by the government to reduce these rising pendency cases? And then what further steps can be taken so that we can ensure that justice is not delayed and not denied to the citizens of India? So now let's start with the first thing, which is the current status of pendency of cases in the judicial system. We will be analyzing this across multiple sectors, that is, across multiple levels of judiciary. So we know that there is subordinate level, there is High Court, and then there's Supreme Court. So what is the amount or what is the quantum of pendency across the levels? Second variation, what is the regional variation, that is state-wise distribution. And then we will see what is the growth prospects and how these cases are basically growing, how are they rising. So first of all, talking about across the levels, while this problem is very severe across all the three stages of judiciary, it is very acute at the subordinate or at the lower levels. Lower levels are also plagued with some other problems, which is majority of the cases are filed in the lower levels. We know we don't really approach High Court and Supreme Court directly. We generally go to the district court, right? Second is there is rising shortages of judges. In fact, the highest number of vacant seats among all the three tiers is in the lower level only. Please put your focus on this data. In Supreme Court, the number of cases pending are about 54,000, High Courts 43 lakhs, and subordinate courts 2.76 crore. This data needs to be noted down in your note sheets because it is important for putting forward in your mains answers. Now, across level, we know that it is mostly acute at the subordinates level or the lower level. Okay, also talking about the regional variation, of course, where there is more population, there will be more filing of the cases, more legal disputes. So this corresponds to some of the states which are having more or higher number of judicial pendency as compared to the national average. So talk about the states like states of UP, then we have Tamil Nadu, then we have the High Court of Patna, basically Bihar. So all of them have got a rising cases of up to 5 to 6 million cases which are pending in their respective states only. So there is regional variation as well. Why are we studying about regional variation? Because if I start implementing policy solution to resolve the judicial pendency, it should start with the priority state first. I should first look into states like UP, Bihar, Tamil Nadu, where cases are growing more as compared to other ones. Okay, so that is why knowing the regional variation is very important. We have learned it through this graph. Next is steady growth in the pendency. Not only we have got pendency since last 30 years, but also this rate is growing even more so. You can look into this graph which tells us that in the Supreme Court in 2006 there were 40,000 cases pending, and now it is 60,000 in the year 2019. In the case of subordinate court, it is 3 crores in 2019, and back in 2006 it was just 2.5 crores. So the rate is also growing. So not only we need to deal with the existing pendency, but also we need to deal with the issue of rising growth of pendency. So we've understood that the growth is also rising. Second is, we already had some mechanisms. For example, establishment of a fast track court, establishment of something which we call as quasi-judiciary bodies, which are tribunals. While they were there for fast tracking the process of judiciary, but they are the ones who are also now getting plagued with judicial pendency. In fact, one of the very important tribunal, the NCLT, National Company Law Tribunal, that is seeing pendency of over 30,000 cases. So cases are also getting piled up, and since these tribunals, which are very important for economy, because let's say if there are about 30,000 cases pending over there, which means what is getting compromised? The ease of doing business in India. So therefore, rising cases in NCLT and other tribunals can also be seen. So these remedial measures are also now getting played with the same problem that they were supposed to adjust. Now, what are the reasons? What are the reasons for high pendency of the cases? First and foremost, and please remember this formula, for any infrastructural or any structural inefficiency in the administration, there are some formulas involved. One is the lack of or the disequilibrium between demand and supply. So, which means the demand or the number of litigants are increasing with the growing population, and with the, first of all, growing population, and with the growing awareness of the litigation processes, and therefore you can see a lot of rise in PIL routes, public interest litigation. So this is also rising. Demand is rising, but the supply is not in consonance. What do we mean by supply? Supply is the infrastructure, the judiciary infrastructure that is available. Supply is the human resources. Supply is the technological intervention which can up the game of efficiency in resolving these cases. So, because there is disequilibrium in demand and supply, some of these are the broad reasons why the judicial pendency is happening. Secondly, there is problem with 3 Fs, that is funds, functions and functionaries, and it happens with all the cases. Lack of funds leads to lack of resources, lack of innovative interventions, for example including judiciary, including technology into judiciary. So lack of funds is one reason. Then lack of functionaries or the human resources, efficient human resources are also a reason. Vacancy in the number of judges could be a reason, and also the lack of functions. Functions means the very judicial process which is operative in India. Paper pe paper, tariq pe tariq syndrome that is there. That is because of the function, the complexity of the cases, the complexity of the processes, legal processes that are followed up. So if I sum up, or if I basically try to jot down all the points that are leading to high pendency, first of all is the shortages of judges. In fact, if you see that the number of judges in USA are 107 per million population, and in the case of India it is just and strikingly only 17 per million population. So that is the number of judges scarcity that we are having right now. Second is the lack of infrastructure in the terms of digital infrastructure in the terms of courtrooms. They are also lacking. Why? Because of the lack of financial resources, financial aids that are given to them. So that is also there. Then the complexity of the cases could also be a rising reason. Many of the cases, especially the company cases, the corporate cases, are of such nature they cannot be expedited very quickly, because it involves consultation with multiple stakeholders. It involves consultation of multiple experts, advices from experts. So such complexity also increases the amount of time that is taken for case resolution. Next is procedural delays. Procedural delays could happen because one is not able to locate all the witnesses at the right point in time, so it delays the process. You're not able to collect the right information and evidence at the right time. So of course you have to give some other date and some other date and some other date, which leads to procedural delays and overall delay in the delivery of justice. Next is weak enforcement of the court order. Even if the court has already made the order, it takes a lot of time, and in fact sometimes it is not even enforced in place. So it eventually leads to piling up of the same problem again and again. Next is increased legal awareness, which I have already highlighted. This is lead to increase in the demand of judiciary. Demand of judiciary in the country of India has also increased with the increasing population, increasing awareness, and therefore every second day you can see news of some PIL being filed in Supreme Court or High Court. These are the reasons. So how does it impact the justice delivery system? First of all, it causes delay. Delay in the administration of justice means people losing faith in the Indian judiciary. Second, it also overburdens the court system because the number of judges are limited and the cases are rising with a growth rate of 2.6%, which means that even the existing infrastructure would be burdened and not able to take the load. It will fall apart more, and the growth rate will rise more. Second is, it also, because it is time taking, it will also call off more financial or give off more financial burden on the litigants, because now they have to give money to a lot of advocates, to a lot of process for a longer period of time. This also further degrades the social fabric because it further marginalizes the poor and the vulnerable sections of society who cannot afford such litigations for a longer period of time. Second, therefore, it causes social injustice. To whom? To the victims and the witnesses. They might die, they might escape, the evidences might be forged, and this will lead to injustice to the actual victims or the witnesses. Next is, it also therefore has a negative impact on the economy because it is not only making the marginalized people more poorer, it is also impacting resolution of corporate cases, resolution of financial cases that are financially important for the country. Therefore, it also has a negative impact on the justice quality if you will try to expedite the process. Let's say if you tell a judge that you try to resolve 10 cases per day, he can do, but of course it will affect the merit of the quality of the case resolution. So that can also not be done. So then what can we do and what measures have Indian government taken so far? So first and foremost, the basic problem was that we do not have funds and proper functions and functionaries, right? So in order to first of all improve functions means bringing all the stakeholders at the same table at the right time. For that, maybe we need to have more flexible approach towards what we call as courtrooms. So can't we bring the courtroom as in a digital format? So that has been done by the Government of India in 2019 by introducing the e-court scheme. Herein all the stakeholders, the litigants, their advocates, the police and the judges, all of them come together at the same point in time because they do not require the infrastructure. So when the infrastructure requirement is not there, so it also deals away with that challenge we saw, lack of infrastructure, because now everything is getting converted digitally. So e-courts room or virtual courts room is important. E-courts portal is also important to bring in all the stakeholders together on board in a single unified portal, so that sharing of information, updation of the case, all of that can be done. Next is a lot of things which does not require a litigant to come or file case digital or physically can be done or can be delegated on a digital platform, right? So therefore, e-filing has been started by Government of India. You can now also make e-payments on the court fees and fines so that you do not need to physically come to the place, or it doesn't take a lot of time for your fees to be processed, or it also doesn't involve corruption and frauds in between. Next is to have an interoperable criminal justice system. This is also incorporated by the e-system of Supreme Court of India. So what they have done, they have created this interoperable system for criminal justice, wherein all the forensic scientists, their data, the jails, data from the jails, data from the police stations, data from the advocate side, litigant side, witness side, all of them are collaborated and interchanged with each other, so that access to basic information evidences is not a hurdle, is not creating pendency of the cases. Next is having fast track courts, which we already have, but having fast track courts which are efficient. For that, we need to introduce more technology in them. We need to we need to bring more resources or judges in the fast track courts. We can create more fast track courts depending on the genre, specific genre. For example, resolving disputes related to women harassment or child harassment, etc. Then to have alternate dispute resolution, this we have already done with the help of Lok Adalat, with the help of Gram Nyayalayas, the family courts, all have been statutorily introduced into Indian system. Why? To expedite the cases of judicial resolution. Now, while all of this is already done, what else needs to be done? Some steps which are further recommended from our side is, first of all, to increase the number of judges. So back in 1987, Law Commission of India already made the recommendation that the judges to population count should be 50 per million. Today, in 2024, we still have 17 judges per million population. And this is very less as compared to the other countries like US and UK, where it is more than 80 judges per million population. So naturally, we require more resources, more human resources to be inducted into the process. Second is to expand the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. Now we can also introduce systems like mediation, conciliation, arbitration process, which does not require the involvement of traditional judicial route, which of course takes more time as compared to these routes. Next is to streamline the entire legal process by building a single portal, a single platform where all of the data, resources, stakeholders can be collated together. Next is strengthening the enforcement of the court orders. Even if we do all of this and the court has also delivered the order, what will happen if it is not enforced into reality? It will further pile up cases, and one unresolved case would lead to creation of 5 more cases. So the very basic need of the hour is to enforce the court order at the right time, and this has to be done by the administration, future administrators like you. So now that we have understood the culture of adjournments, the culture of pendency in judiciary, please try to answer this question over here. Now the next topic is about a climate study. The study reveals that 85%, mind you, 85% of Indian districts are exposed to extreme climate events, which is eventually going to affect 1.47 billion people by 2036. Just imagine the consequences it could have if it is not mitigated at the right time. So taking cue from this study, we will first of all try to define what do we mean by extreme weather events and how climate change is contributing to the same. We will understand first of all the exact definition of extreme weather events, because that will help you to write down a good introduction if this topic comes up in the mains. So first of all, according to IPCC and United Nations, any event which is rare, occurring at a particular place, at an uncertain or unlikely time of the year, that is considered as an extreme weather event. So here is a proper definition. It should include terms like rare, at a particular place, and at an uncertain time of year. IMD, the Indian Meteorological Department, also recognizes some of the events as the extreme weather events. So nowadays, if you see the rainfall, it is coming in the form of a cloud burst. If you are seeing Loo, it is coming in the form of heat wave. If you are seeing cold happening, you actually see in the form of cold waves. So the extremities of these events are actually the names given to extreme weather event, and IMD recognizes lightning, thunderstorms, intense rainfall, cloudburst, landslide, flood, cold wave, heat waves, cyclones and storms. The hailstorms, the dust storms and the gales. Gales stands for very windy or very high speeded wind. So all of these are recognized by IMD as the extreme weather event. You can put it in the form of a flowchart in your answer. Now talking about why is this a concern? Because these extreme weather events used to happen previously also, before the pre-industrial era also. But now the frequency and the intensity have increased more. In fact, intensity and frequency have increased up to 5 times after the Industrial Revolution, and this has been highlighted by a report of World Meteorological Organization named Global State of Climate Report, which suggests that not only these extreme weather events are happening, they are accelerated with rising frequency and rising intensity. Now, Talking about the impact of climate change, there are multiple factors contributing to it, but one of the most significant impact is that of climate change over these extreme weather events. So what are the impacts and how is it justified? First of all, the climate change has led to alteration of the pressure patterns, alteration of the polar vortex, alteration of the frequency of events, for example, cyclones, typhoons, etc. Also, rising intensity is taking place of the same disasters. So such impacts are there of climate change, which has led to the following event. First and foremost are the forest fires. You've already seen across the last 3 years that in the places of Canada, in the places of USA, in the places of Catalonia, Spain, Egypt, Greece, in the places of Australia, even in India at many places, there have been rising instances of forest fire. It has been said by a report that it has increased up to 5 times ever since the climate change is happening. So in the last 5 years, the forest fire events have increased up to 5 times. That is happening because of climate change. Second is, there is simultaneous occurrence of floods and drought in the same place only. Flood is also happening and drought is also happening. So think about the states like Tamil Nadu and Odisha. The coastal states of Odisha are very frequently flooded. Why? Because of torrential rainfall, heavy or rising cyclonic activity. At the same time, when the coastal areas are getting flooded, there are other areas, for example, Chennai, a very prominent capital city, which has witnessed day zero because of drying up of all the existing reservoirs there. So at the same place now, because of the climate change, we are seeing both floods and droughts, extreme sides of the spectrum together. Next is Arabian Sea, which is witnessing more cyclones. So what is happening as compared to the Pacific Ocean and as compared to the Atlantic Ocean? Indian Ocean, because of its size and shape, is experiencing more heating as compared to the other parts. Now, Arabian Sea is seeing more cyclonic activity as compared to Bay of Bengal. In fact, the amount of activity has risen up to 20 times in the last 3 years only. You've seen Cyclone Amphan, Cyclone Tokate, Cyclone Gulab. In fact, at many places, the re-emergence of cyclone has also been seen. In the case of Gulab, so it started from Bay of Bengal, then it ended, it vanished in around Sri Lanka, and then it further resurfaced in the Arabian Sea, and this is happening because of subsequent rise and heating up of the ocean. So Arabian Sea is witnessing more cyclones than ever, 20% more in the last 3 years. Then there is less stable polar vortex. So talk about the polar vortex, which is basically responsible for keeping intact the colder winds to the polar areas only. Now what happens if this polar vortex, which was supposed to be limited till here, is now getting expanded to areas like USA and some parts of Europe, middle part of Europe. In that case, it will lead to intensive cold waves in the habitable areas of USA. This led to many deaths in the last year. So cold waves are also a problem. Why? Because of rising polar vortex. Next is swapping of the nature of extreme event, which means that the areas previously known for drought are now getting flooded because of cloudburst, torrential rains. Classic example, the Barbi district of Rajasthan. Classically known as a desert and also for its drought-prone nature, it got flooded in the year 2006, and in fact a recent study of CEEW has also shown that 40% of the Indian districts who were primarily flood oriented have now turned drought oriented and vice versa. These are the impacts. Now, what are the measures which will enhance our preparedness, because climate change cannot be stopped single-handedly? First and foremost, what is the primary cause of climate change? It is the greenhouse gas. How to stop it? By reducing the emissions. We have got multiple policies. Comprehensively, we have got the National Action Plan for Climate Change in India, which started from 2012. So all of these efforts, if they are comprehensively taken up together at a national level, effectively strategized and also delivered in the ground, will help us reduce the emission reduction or not? Yes. Emissions primarily also come from the thermal power plant. Do you agree with that? Most of the sulfur emission, methane emission comes from there. Can we replace it with the renewable energy projects? Yes. So replacement or taking up greener alternative, that is also important. Next is to have a vulnerability check with the help of mapping. So we have deployed a lot of satellites. What are they doing exactly? If they are not creating an atlas for us, a climate risk atlas for us, to check what are the water stressed areas, what are the areas susceptible to floods and droughts previously, so that we can have an emergency response system enforced, or an emergency response team enforced in those mapped areas. So mapping is very crucial, and for that it should be especially important for Himalayas, where a safety first approach should be adopted, which means that Himalayas should not just be taken up for their natural aesthetic beauty and tourism, should also be taken care of for their risk vulnerability, disaster vulnerability. You should map it beforehand. You should put up the right sensors, check the stress management or the stress susceptibility of Himalayan regions, check for water stress, check for instability of the land beforehand, and create infrastructure which is disaster resilient. So while we are approaching the management and the administration of Himalayas, we should first of all take up the safety first approach and then take up other activities like tourism. Next is having a robust early warning system. Deployment of technology, GPS, satellite could be beneficial in this regard. Second is creating climate resilient infrastructure. This is the only way forward. We can only create the infrastructure which is stress resilient, which is more harmonious, just like in the case of Japan, as they have created in Japan, as they have created in some drought prone areas, for example, Saudi Arabia. So how are they so developed? Why? Because they have already incorporated this infrastructure, lacking in India. So India in 2017 took up the CDRA initiative. CDRA initiative in United Nations, and this is basically India calling up all the countries together to create certain safety measures and certain protocols to ensure that the buildings are disaster resilient. We should also therefore, in order to ensure food stability, call for climate resilient agriculture. Next is integrated climate action plan. Climate action plan of India should be in consonance with the climate action plan of Bangladesh, with Bhutan, with Nepal, with Pakistan if they do so. So integrated climate action plan is the need of the hour. There cannot be action plan for one particular state. There should be specialized plans, but they should be integrated too. Talking about the specialized plan, the best plans come from the local solutions. So first of all, because one size does not fit all, if there is a drought prone area, should be dealt differently as compared to a flood prone area, or if there's a mixed or a hybrid problem, then that should be dealt differently. So local solutions are needed. For example, that we have deployed in Andaman and Nicobar with the help of those tribes. Next is to also call for climate justice, especially for those states, districts and nations which are deplorably suffering from climate injustice. They were the not biggest emitters, but they are the biggest sufferers. So climate justice needs to be incorporated, and that needs international intention. Now, a question for you: highlight the impact of climate change on extreme weather events. Also highlight the measures that need to be taken in order to enhance our preparedness. You try to solve this question with the help of information that we have just now taught you. And now we will analyze the roles and functions of a body which ensures that one does not do money laundering and violation of foreign exchange laws in the country. This is the Enforcement Directorate. Enforcement Directorate has been in news because it has provisionally attached some of the properties worth a lot of crores in the money laundering case of Amtech Auto Limited. So if in the ethics paper GS4, if you are asked something about money laundering, you can take example of Amtech Auto Limited, recently under the vigilance and radar of ED. Talking about Enforcement Directorate, of course it's a directorate, which means it's a non-statutory attached body to a ministry. Because it deals with the financial matters, it is actually the premier financial investigation body of India, which means any financial frauds happen, ED will be inspecting for it. So it is a directorate, which means it is attached into a ministry which is related to finance. That is, it is attached to Ministry of Finance. Now within that also there are multiple departments. There is Department of Revenue, Department of Expenditure, Department of Financial Services, etc. So this particular body is attached under Department of which one? Department of Revenue. Because when the violation of foreign exchange happens, when the money laundering happens, who suffers? The revenue aspect of our country suffers. Therefore, it is under Department of Revenue. Now talking about the structure, it is headquartered in New Delhi with 5 regional offices placed in Mumbai, Chennai, Chandigarh, Kolkata and Delhi. Please remember that apart from the metro cities, it is also there in Chandigarh. Next, The recruitment. So have you ever heard that there is a separate ED examination? No. So there is direct in-house recruitment that is done among the posted IAS, IPS and IRS officers. So that, and from the other investigation agencies, for example CBI, so recruitment is done directly from there. Next is the tenure. So the tenure is of 2 years first of all, but for the director it can be extended from 2 to 5 years, but not at one go, but actually giving 3 annual extension, which means 2 year, then giving an extension of 1 year, then 1 year, then 1 year, amounting to total 5 years. Now, when it is named as Enforcement Directorate, what is it actually enforcing? It is enforcing 3 very important laws. First and foremost is the COFEPOSA, or the Conservation of Foreign Exchange and Prevention of Smuggling Activities Act of 1974. This basically helps it to enforce the foreign exchange laws which could be violated to launder the money or to smuggling or for doing the smuggling. Now, it also sponsors the cases of preventive detention with regard to the contravention of the FEMA, Foreign Exchange Management Act. Under the FEMA, it is also given the authority to not just investigate about any case related to this matter, but also adjudicate and penalize them. So does it have a penalization power? Yes, and therefore it is able to attach these bodies, these areas or these immovable illegal properties. The next act which it enforces is the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, under which it is given the power to trace the asset which are probably derived from the proceeds of crime. Second, to provisionally attach the property, we just now seen in this case. So in this case, which act has it enforced? The Prevention of Money Laundering one. Okay. Next, to ensure the prosecution of the offenders and confiscation of the property. But this will not be done by the ED. Confiscation and prosecution will be done by special courts attached with ED. Next, and the third act which it enforces is regarding the Fugitive Economic Offenders Act. How do you define fugitive economic offender? A person who has been convicted for an offence worth of more than 100 crore rupees and has been evading the process or the judicial proceedings by being outside the jurisdiction of the Indian courts. That particular person is declared as fugitive economic offender. If you want to relate with it, think about Nirav Modi, think about Vijay Mallya. They have been declared as Enforcement Directorate, and to confiscate their properties, the power is with the special court assigned under Enforcement Directorate. Of course, this body has got multiple issues as well. First of all, can you see that it can enforce a lot of things? It can investigate a lot of properties, confiscate a lot of properties. So it has got huge discretion. So wherever the discretion is enlarged, it could be violated as well. So there is the chance of misusing the power, violating the power that they have. Second is lack of transparency on the selection of cases. So let's say if ED recognizes that there are 5 cases in hand where there could probably be mismanagement of money or smuggling or money laundering. In this case, ED has only chosen B, C and D and left A and E. So this randomized selection of cases actually is a question upon the transparency and the proficiency of the ED's functioning. So lack of transparency is there. Low conviction has also been stated. In the last 10 years, the conviction rate of ED is less than 10%. So of the 100 cases that it has inspected, only 10 came out to be actually laundering the money. Conviction is less, so which also tells us that it could be abusing the power. Next is the political partisanship. Most of the cases that the ED has been attaching or the ED has been investigating are related to the people who are not in political power. So it also showcases that there could be political partisanship as to which case will be taken up first by the ED at what point in time. Next are the reforms suggested, because of course being civil servant, you will be working on them in future. So first of all, we need to enhance the coordination with other agencies. For example, the forensics labs, the CBI, the ED, the IB, the RAW, everyone has to come together. So coordination is the key. Second is digitization and data analytics, so that the conviction could be produced very quickly. Data organization could be there, and data is the key for building efficiency in everything, be it judiciary or be it ED. Next is building a robust whistleblower protection program. Many a times the whistleblower is at the threat of his or her life. So if we intact them or if we provide them robust protection, then this conviction rate will also rise. Next is clearer legal framework as to what are the judicial jurisdictions, or what are the limitations of the power of ED. Next is increased accountability and transparency of the ED towards the people. So on what grounds are they choosing? It should be reported to the Prime Minister, then it should be reported to the Parliament. Then reduced political interference is a must if we want to make our India corruption free and money laundering free, so that our revenues could be better utilized for building a developed India at a shorter period of time. Now comes a very interesting topic and actually very important for the exam. This is the National Register of Citizens. So recently what happened, Assam's Chief Minister has made a very striking remark that if somebody has got no NRC, then the person will also not be able to avail Aadhaar. With this, let me ask a question to you. Is Aadhaar a proof of citizenship in India? Try to answer that in the comment box. Now, so because this striking remark has been made, we will see what is the importance of NRC and why Assam is demanding NRC. To understand that, please understand the geography of Assam. So Assam, which is the largest northeast state, shares its border with Bangladesh. Bangladesh, also known as East Pakistan. So previous to the independence and post-independence, when we were partitioned, a lot of migration started happening from Bangladesh towards primarily Assam. Lot of immigrants were coming, but it was eventually noticed that 6 million out of the 26 million population of Assam are actually the illegal immigrants who are coming from Bangladesh without any valid document. Now, this creates a problem with the resource distribution. Resources are limited with any state, especially with a resource crunch state like Assam, like Northeast, which is not really connected with the mainland India. Because of the resource crunch, the competition of the resources will rise. Competition for food, employment, government avenues and facilities will rise among the population. And the people who are legitimate citizen of Assam, residents of Assam, will feel violated if it is distributed unduly with the illegal immigrants who are coming from Bangladesh. So therefore now started the Assam agitation, especially with the leadership of the Assam Students Union. So they in 1978 started Assam agitation, who demanded for the identification, removal and the deportation of the illegal immigrants. Because this was a huge outcry in the Assam back then, the Rajiv Gandhi government in 1985 set an Assam Accord with the protesters, and they promised, according to this accord signed in 1985, to do what? To identify the illegal immigrants who arrived after March 24, 1971. Why this date was set? Because in 1971, the Bangladesh was getting liberated, and as a result of this, as a result of rising atrocities against the Bangladeshis, they started flooding away to India, especially to Assam. So there itself, they saw about 3 million people coming to India without legitimate documents. So this was a quantity of immigrant or immigration that happened from Bangladesh. That was the main concern. So therefore, the deadline was set during this time only, when massive immigration happened. So this process started in 2013 under the orders of Supreme Court, and it was released for the first time in 2019. Under this, who were qualified to be included into NRC? So what is NRC? National Register for Citizen. It is a national registry which entails the list of the people who are legal citizens of India, so that we can identify the illegal immigrants of our country. Now, this will help us to allocate the government resources, facilities judicially and prioritizingly towards the citizens of India. So who will be included under NRC? First of all, whoever is there in NRC 1951. Second, NRC was, by the way, conducted pan-wide, pan-India in 1951. And now Assam is the only state for which a separate NRC was conducted because of rising illegal immigrant problem. Now, the other people, anybody who is under the electoral roll up to the midnight of 24th of March 1971, or anybody who has got any admissible document, for example, passport or voter card or Aadhaar card, anything issued up to the midnight of 24th March. Of course, not Aadhaar card, it was not issued back then. But this admissible document could be from any part of India. The point is not to be a citizen or a resident of Assam, but to be a citizen of India. So these people will be included under NRC. What happened? That when 2019 list was released, it was observed that about 2 million people who were residing in Assam, they were actually not considered into the NRC. So they were evicted from this list. Now, Now, what happens to a person who's not included in the list of NRC? Are they immediately deported? No. First of all, there is a provision of appeal. To whom will they appeal? They will appeal to the foreign court. So, the Foreigner Tribunal of India is given the jurisdiction, and they can also approach the High Court and the Supreme Court. So they can appeal over there within 120 days of the declaration of NRC. Second, they can prove the citizenship of their ancestors. So if they were the citizens of India before 1971, then also they can be considered for NRC. Second is, there is no immediate detention of the people. Why? Because first of all, they can approach to the foreigners tribunal. Only upon the decision of the foreigner tribunal will any action be taken on them. The second problem is, even if we declare them not a part of NRC, what will happen to them? Will they be repatriated to Bangladesh? No, that is actually an issue with NRC. Why? Because India does not have a formal repatriation treaty with Bangladesh. Another very important key point. Now, what was the need of NRC? First of all, to identify the illegal immigrant, because it was growing too much. There was a competition on the resources, and therefore there was also rising conflict among the residents and the non-residents, or between the citizens and the illegal immigrants. Second, to protect the national security, because these conflicts will not only threaten the national security but international also. They can be radicalized by international elements, for example, the Bangladeshi radicalists or the Chinese radicalists. Second, to ensure the social justice, especially for the marginalized tribes of Assam. So for them to be on priority basis given the government facilities, government resources, ration, etc., we first have to identify the right people, the right beneficiaries, and ensure that they are getting it on priority basis. So it will ensure social justice, it will ensure economic justice, it will ensure judiciary also. Why? Because it is a legal mandate of the Foreigners Act that anybody who is an illegally living foreigner, illegally living immigrant, they have to be evicted from India, and the power is there with the Foreigners Act. Next is, or the Foreigners Tribunal, which is constituted under this act. Next is addressing the concern of indigenous population, for example, the T tribes. So they are the people who are not able to get the documentation. In fact, it has been highlighted that more than 50% of the marginalized people do not have the access to basic legitimized documents, for example, voter ID, for example, even their birth or death certification. So therefore, it has to particularly address the concern of indigenous population, which it does with the NRC. Next is, it can also create a fake vote bank. So in lieu of protecting these illegal immigrants, some of the parties can vouch on them, can actually give them shelter in some of the other states like Rajasthan, UP. They're also shifted there now. So they live under false identities over there to act as a fake vote bank for some political parties. So what are the challenges associated now with NRC? Because it is highly debatable. First and foremost, it actually excludes some of the genuine citizens. Supreme Court in 2021 got about lakhs of requesting for re-verification because 2 million people were removed from NRC immediately. Next is, there is also potential for discrimination. It was seen that among all the people who were excluded, majority were Muslims. So this could also be potentially used as a discriminatory tool against this particular community. Second, it also causes costs and overburdening with delays. So it requires not only the government employees, the personnel and the functionaries, but also funds. It also requires a lot of time. In fact, this NRC, published in 2019, it took nearly 1 decade to be prepared, involvement of 50,000 government employees and 1,200 crore rupees to be taken. So it leads to a lot of administrative delays and cost also. Next is lack of proper documentation. There was actually some of the allegations that there were frauds with the data collection. There were chances of corruption as well. Data forgery was also done. So lack of proper documentation was also a major reason. Next is the lack of legal documents with the marginalized section. UNICEF has already highlighted that only 52% of the people in India, not only Assam, are registered, which means only 52% of the birth are registered. And this is the most primary documentation that one needs. So then think about the voter ID cards and the Aadhaar cards that they need to have. They do not have it. So, and also Aadhaar is not a legal document for citizenship. It is only for availing the government benefits. Now, so they do not have legal documents, so they will naturally, especially the marginalized communities which require government resources and aid the most, they will naturally be evicted out of the process. So therefore, this list that was that was out in 2019 was heavily contested and criticized. Then there is no clarity over the fate of the excluded people. What will happen to them? Will you not just give them, will you stop giving them the fundamental rights? Will they live in your own country without the basic resources? Will they be expatriated to Bangladesh? So what will happen? The fate is not clear. So therefore, what are we creating NRC for is not clear. So that agenda needs to be clarified. Then what can be the way forward? First of all, address the exclusion concerns. There should be rightful mechanisms of appeals and re-verification. We should also improve data collection and verification with the help of suitable technologies. We should prioritize human rights at all the times, because we are also signatory to Human Rights Convention of United Nations. So we cannot just exclude people and then make them homeless and landless. Transparent processes are required when this evaluation is conducted. For that, public scrutiny and public access to data while the census is going on is very important, and then judicial oversight into the entire procedure while creating the list should also be there, so that any procedural lapses could be identified before the list is out, and so that it can be fixed as and when it happens. Now, what is the difference between NPR, National Population Register, and National Register of Citizens? Seemingly same name, but National Population Register is carried out for understanding the differences between urban and rural population, and the NRC is considered or carried out to identify to classify the citizens and the immigrants or non-citizens. This is the difference between both these exercises. Now we will very quickly, from prelims point of view, understand what is a typhoon, because what happened is Asia, especially the western coast of Pacific, is witnessing the strongest typhoon in a decade. Name is Yagi. It has made landfall in Chinese island and also in Vietnam. So first of all, let's look into what is a typhoon. So typhoon is a kind of cyclone only. In fact, another name of tropical cyclone, which emerges in areas between 100 degrees east and 180 degrees east, which means in this particular area. Here is where typhoon happens. If same tropical cyclone is happening in the coast of Australia, then this is known as Willy Willy. If it is happening in the coast of Indian Ocean, then it is known as cyclone. If it is happening in the coast of USA, then it is known as USA or Canada, then it is hurricanes. Okay, so there are different names of tropical cyclone. One such name is typhoon. Typhoon generally happens in Northwest Pacific Ocean, associated with, again, strong wind and heavy rain formation, torrential rains similar to that of oceans. Now, we've already read about the extreme weather event. So this one is strongest in the decade. Why? Because this has been considered as a super typhoon. Super typhoon, according to the Saffir-Simpson scale. Please remember, Saffir-Simpson scale is to categorize, is to measure the intensity of a cyclone, and most of the cyclones nowadays are coming at the scale of 3 to 5, and this particular typhoon is of a scale of 5, heavily destructive. So because this one has got a very higher sustained wind velocity, could travel huge kilometers per hour, and therefore it is considered as a strong category, as a super category of cyclonic activity. What are the factors causing the formation of typhoon? It is very similar to that of a tropical cyclone. First is sustained ocean temperature of 26.5 degrees or higher, so that it creates good amount of low pressure. Low pressure will create instability, air will start rising, there will be a column developed. Upon reaching the higher areas, it will generate energy of condensations. This latent heat of condensation will be so strong that it will start circulating this entire system. The circulation also happens because of the Coriolis force, which is adequately present in this area. Okay, then there should be minimum vertical wind shear. If, let's say, I have created a pile of biscuits and I have blown a wind in a horizontal direction, it will be shedding. So this is known as a column, and this is known as wind shear. So wind shear should be minimum. That is, this column should not be disturbed horizontally, so that it is maintained. This instability is maintained. Instability is very important ground for developing monsoon-like condition, for developing storm-like condition. Any vertical movement will only happen because of instability. Now, initial low pressure area is also very important, and high moisture content is important. More the moisture, more the amount of latent heat of condensation. more the amount of moisture is happening. Why? Because it is happening in the coastal areas. It is happening actually in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, in the Atlantic Ocean. Okay. Here is a PYQ practice question. In the South Atlantic and Southeastern Pacific, in the tropical latitude, cyclone does not originate. So what is the reason for it? You try to answer this because this is a PYQ asked in 2050. Now what we have for you are very interesting prelim snippets. One of them, my favorite, Amazon rainforest. So Amazon rainforest are world's largest tropical rainforest, but lesser do you know that they are also world's largest wetland system. Why? Because this is a system which is also containing largest river basin in the world. Which river feeds this rainforested area? This rainforested area, which is 2 million square miles covering 9 countries in total, this is the expanse of Amazon rainforest, is drained by Amazon River, second largest in the world, but it is drained by 1100 tributaries of the Amazon River, and this makes it world's largest river system, world's largest watershed, which holds 20% of the global fresh water supply. Because it is also lying in the tropical region, which means climate is hot and humid, average temperatures are 25 degrees centigrade, tributary is there, climate is hot, which means lot of humidity would be there. Humidity is very important for growth of microorganisms or the other biodiversity. So therefore, this region is very highly rich in biodiversity. In fact, because the humidity ranges between 77 to 88% around the year, it is holding more than 10% of the Earth's total species and highest plant diversity, especially highest amount of epiphytic plants. Now, talking about the number of countries which are surrounded or which are encapsulated in this Amazon rainforest, they are Suriname, Guyana, there is also French Guiana, there is Venezuela, there's Colombia, there's Ecuador, there's Peru, there's Bolivia, there's Brazil. So these are the regions. Amazon rainforest was also in news because dry spells are going on over here. Forest fires have been there. So heavy deforestation by the Brazilian authorities were also done over here. And also recently in news because some initiative is there to survey the Amazon because it is entailing world's largest number of species. So that is there. Now talking about some interesting aspects. First of all, vegetation structure. Please understand, here is where the competition among the tree is very high. Some of the trees will grow to the highest of heights. These are known as emergent layers. Emergent, which is the tallest of the trees, and it also actually has a lot of tall trees. Okay. Now the second thing is the canopy layer. Canopy layer, which is basically the average height of all the trees over there, which is actually very high, 200 feet high is a canopy layer. Then there is this understory layer. Understory layer, it is very stratified because a lot of trees can't compete because the canopy is so dense, sunlight could not come inside. So if sunlight is not coming inside, the understory is where the sparse as compared to temperate kind of areas or subtropical kind of areas. Okay, so understory includes small trees, palms, woody vines. There is undergrowth. Undergrowth is also very small, very sparse, very scattered. Epiphytes among these trees are very dense, and the forest floor is also very sparse. Why? Because sunlight is not able to reach, so you won't see a lot of grasses there. You will see very heighted trees. Now, as you see that UPSC is frequently asking important species. So, two important species are there in Amazon rainforest. First is the bromeliads. So, bromeliads are pineapple-like plants that grow on tall canopy trees, these three emergent layers, and they collect water in their leaf bases, providing water for the animals. So, it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. You can quote this example also, and bromeliads are only uniquely found in Amazon rainforest. Next is the kapok tree. Kapok tree, which is used for creating ropes and sustainable fabric. Also, its fruit provides food for monkeys and bats. So, these water hydrophobic fibers are there in the kapok tree, which is endemic to Amazon rainforest. The wetland system, of which is also largest in the world because it hosts 1100 tributaries of Amazon river. Naturally, the wetland would be very extensive, largest in the world. Therefore, it is also known as the kidney or the lungs of the world. So this wetland system is known as Varzea. So you can be asked in the paper, what is Varzea? It refers to wetland ecosystem of Amazon rainforest. Coming to the next one. Okay. Now, in 2021, an entire scenario was put forward by UPSC, and you were to answer the question that it is most likely the description of coniferous, dry deciduous, mangrove, tropical rainforest. So here some of the words were that the leaf litter decomposes faster. Why? Because there is a lot of humidity there. Second, soil surface is bare, which means there's no grasses, sparse vegetation. Apart from trees, vegetation is largely composed of plant forms that reach up to canopy vicariously. So canopy is very vicarious. Second, climbing the trees or growing epiphytes are also there, especially in the rooted up branches of the tree. So this is classic example of tropical rainforest. Now we also have Archaeological Survey of India in news today. So first of all, it is under which ministry? So it is under the Ministry of Culture. It works under two legal frameworks. So it is empowered by Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains Act of 1958 and Antiquities and Art Treasure Act of 1974, under which it establishes the DPSP, the Directive Principle of State Policy, to preserve the Indian culture and heritage. So it was initially though established by Alexander Cunningham, the Director General of ASI. So in 1861 it was established for the first time. Previous efforts were also made by the Asiatic Society, but also it is empowered under these two particular acts to preserve the archaeological sites of India, and especially those areas which are of national importance. Where are the headquarters of ASI located? Try to answer that in the comment box. Coming to the next topic, this is about a new kind of schooling which is in line with the new national education policy. So this is the PM Shri school. So what happens is, though it is a centrally sponsored scheme, please understand this carefully. Though it is centrally sponsored, education is a concurrent subject, which means that states can either choose to create PM Shri schools or could not choose. But what happened? That central government, upon seeing that many states are not choosing to create PM Shri schools, they stopped the funding of Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan also for these states. So now these states are coming back and they are telling to center that we will be creating PM Shri schools. This is a centrally sponsored scheme, please remember that. And this is basically to create exemplar schools which are in line with the national education policy. These will be created, these will be sponsored by the center for the 5 years, and after that state has to bear the cost. So for the 5 years from 2022 to 2027, it will be funded by center. It will show all the components of national education policy, and it will not only take care of the academic needs of the student but also the entire personality development, along with educating them on the lines of new technology and new demands of the work environment. Now thirdly, Gulf Cooperation Council was in news. So from prelims point of view, we'll understand it. First of all, it's a political and economic alliance of 6 Middle Eastern countries. It was established in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, in the year of 1981. The presidency will keep on rotating annually, and the organization structure includes a Supreme Council, which makes all the decisions, Ministerial Council, and the Secretariat General, which drafts the rules. Then currently, why is this particular body important for us? Because it is India's largest trading partner. Of course, because it has countries like Kuwait and it has UAE. So definitely, we are the largest importing, exporting partners of theirs, and they are ours. So 145 billion worth trade happens between India and GCC. It contributes almost 35% of India's oil import and 70% of the gas import. Which countries are a part of it? It's very important. Please remember, except for Yemen, all the countries below Iraq or starting from Saudi Arabia, all of them are part of GCC. In total, 6 countries are there. So this was all about today's discussion. I hope you've liked it. Now, please do not forget to do the homework, that is, try to answer the questions I have asked. Try to solve the mains questions. Try to also solve the prelims pointers or the prelims MCQs that will be there in the end of the video. On this note, goodbye and take care.